I am Jim Collison and live from the Gallup Studios here in Omaha, Nebraska. This is Gallup's Called the Coach, recorded on September 25th, 2018. Called the Coach is a resource for those who want to help others discover and use their strengths. We have Gallup experts and independent strengths coaches share tactics, insights, and strategies to help coaches maximize the talent of individuals, teams, and organizations around the world. On this special edition of Call the Coach, we'll spend some time investigating the experience, emotion, and empirical aspects of each element of Gallup's Q12 engagement instrument to know how it can increase the power in your coaching. If you have questions during this webcast, we do have a live chat room. It's available for you right below the main video window. Just peek down there. It's available for you. Choose the login button, bottom left-hand corner. Choose the guest account. You don't need to create one, or you could use any social media account that's available there. Put your name in where it says guest, take those numbers out, and hit submit. You'll be in the chat room. There's a couple of you out there today. That's the best way to get your questions in during the webcast. If you have questions after you're listening to the recorded version, send us an email, coaching@gallup.com. Don't forget to visit the Gallup Strengths Center, just gallupstrengthscenter.com for all your CliftonStrengths coaching resources and training needs. You can also catch the video and downloadable audio and video, actually, for offline listening, although that offline is a little harder to do, but you can do it. We call that podcasting. It's available on our coaches blog. Head over to coaching.gallup.com. Mike McDonald is our host today. Mike works as a senior workplace consultant here at Gallup. I get to spend Mondays with him now and live from Studio B, Mike. We're doing our first Call to Coach out of the new studio.
I love it. It looks fantastic. It sounds fantastic. Studio B, studio better. Not to be confused with Studio 54, Jim. No, shall we just be clear about that, right?
No, Studio B, still some work to be done. We wanted to move in and kind of sound treat it and figure out what every room has a different, just like every employee has a different set of strengths and does some things better than others. And every room has a different sound feel to it. So we moved into it. We'll do some live testing, just get a feel for it. We'll throw some paint up on the walls and maybe some sound tiles or some other things. But much like the individualization that needs to go on in a room, Mike, every employee needs to be talked, it needs to have a conversation with their manager about the progress, right?
Right.
And today, that's what we're talking about. Why don't you give us a little intro to question 11 today?
Yeah. Hey, guys. So here's where we're going. If we were keeping track at home, we're at question number 11 out of 12. We are really close to getting all the way there. And as you can see in the items and the words and the questions, it represents a journey, right? It represents the fact that we've traveled a certain distance. And that's what this question is indicating really comprehensively, is the fact, hey, we've gone a distance performance-wise together. How far did we go? What happened along the way? Let's stop and sit down and really gauge just what all of this has meant, and not linger on it too long, but how do we look past, grab that currently, but all with an intent to accelerate forward as a result. And so our question that we're going to focus on today, Jim, is number 11. In the past 6 months, someone at work has talked to me about my progress. And as usual, Jim, we're gonna really wrap a lot of resources into our conversation. We're going to bring in our first Break All the Rules book, complete with StrengthsFinder code and Q12 code, so that 10 people can take the Q12 and get a measurement of engagement. And as coaches and consultants, we can help link that leader's top 5 strengths and their style and their delivery to driving engagement with the team that they work with and represent. We will also be bringing in some reference points to another book called 12, The Elements of Great Managing, a nice feature to add on to the first Break All the Rules, literally planetary reactions to best practice advice and case studies around each of the 12 elements that really bring those elements to life. And Jim, I'm going to tell you right now, for this item today, in a way that we haven't maybe in previous items, we are going to work over our workplace reports, particularly our State of the American Workplace report, our Millennial report, and primarily our re-engineering performance management report, which again, I just encourage all of you. You can download those at the flick of a wrist off our Gallup.com site, but we are going to bring a lot of the data and the research and the findings and the application from those last 3 reports into our conversation today.
Looking forward to it. We got a lot. And don't forget, we have lots of resources for you on our coaches blog. So if you go to coaching.gallup.com, go to the resources tab. I've actually created a new section for reports. And on Gallup.com, we have a brand new redesigned reports page that has them all there. So if you're high input or learner, any of those things, you might want to head out there and get that done. Again, coaching.gallup.com, then go to the resources tab. Scroll down a little bit, you'll see the report section that's available for you. All right, Mike, let's dig in. Last 6 months, someone has talked to me about my progress. Let's get right to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's the motivational request that we're all making when we speak to this item, is we want someone to help us review our contributions. In a sense, in what we're really asking for is make sense out of who I am and where I'm at, and what does my performance actually represent? Not only in the past contribution, but what then does it mean to what I might be able to do in the future? And so we're really at the intersection of that conversation. And so it's a powerful conversation, and one that obviously needs to be approached well. And it does take an intentionality and a structure and a design to what that item represents to really effectively deliver it. And so we'll talk about the details, the blueprint of what that conversation can and should look like. Jim, I want to separate our elevation a little bit, our ascent up this pyramid, this hierarchical approach and mindset towards the 12 elements as well. So our previous 4 items that we were just referencing, 7 through 10, really represented this mindset of how do I belong, right? What's my unique relationship-driven contribution that if I'm not here, people miss me as a person. They miss the relationship that we had together. We're going to move that up a notch now into a statement or a mindset of how do we grow? And right, there's a collective sense about this. And so when we get into question 11 and 12, that question of how do we grow now symbolizes the fact that I'm moving through this journey of individual contributor, individual receiver to team member, and now I'm ascending into this mindset of organization member, right? So now in the mindset here, the identity of the individual and the organization are so meshed and intertwined that I can't feel good if Gallup is not doing well as an organization. I'm just not compartmentalized. I'm not siloed or separated from how well Gallup is doing. My identity is that intact with who we all collectively are in all of our offices for all of our associates around the planet. And so there's that irrational, inseparable connection now that's been created. And we see that represented particularly in item 11 and item 12 that we'll talk about next week. But we're starting to see some of the attributes and characteristics and features of what we would call hope. In that future lean now, right? So I want to see a horizon. I know let's make sense out of where we've come from. What have I accomplished? But I want to have that leader in my life really cast me towards that new horizon that we're all collectively a part of, and that my individual understanding within it is really clear to me. So it really is a lot about taking measurements and recasting them forward into a perspective that we can strive towards with all of our abilities and potential that are unique to who we are as individual contributors.
Mike, that's an interesting thought to bring hope in. That's the first time I've been working this on a long time, and that's really the first time I've heard that entering in on question 11 to think about progress and the hope and hopes and dreams and things I'm doing. I think hope is actually probably one of the most misunderstood or underutilized ideas, concepts in the workplace. Yeah. We see it a lot in our student poll work that we do. We ask a lot of hope questions. Of course, late Shane Lopez worked on that idea and brought hope in. But it's interesting. I'm going to spend some more time milling around hope in these, right, as we think about, because it does actually make a big difference between someone staying or someone leaving. Right. And if they have no hope, and it's that is a big factor in them just walking out the door. Right. Yeah. And so when we think about out of our State of the American Workplace, there's some stats that we pulled out of that around this question. What else do we see it affecting, and what kind of impact does it have on the organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot at stake, as there is with each item. A lot about our voluntary discretionary effort that matters to our workplace outcomes. So when we look at it through our State of the American Workplace report, we see significant gains that are made in terms of safety in a workplace, particularly profitability, and again, absenteeism. We just see different mindsets when we have those really powerful, meaningful conversations in the way we're involved in our workplace. And so, so there's a lot there at stake when we do that well and we do that right. This really, Jim, is going to come down to the blocking and tackling of performance management, and quite frankly, the translation of old traditional performance management practices into some of our more current and conventional understanding and study around performance development, right? And development, as we think about the shift and the translation of that mindset, what's represented by those words, right? Management relative to development. Management kind of implying that it's about, maybe it's risk management or course correction or accountability and those types of things, boundary setting, et cetera. But development doesn't do away with that. Development in terms of how we approach performance, and particularly around this item, really is about now the entire person, right? So we'll take into account all of those corrective action features and the accountability and the course correction, et cetera. But we're going to add to it your own personal growth and potential into the mix of that conversation now, and what that item really comes to represent. So this really is the intersection of quite frankly, a great team leader acting as a coach a couple times a year by our advice, sitting down with each person on their team and really having a robust and comprehensive conversation that really captures the best of development, that captures the best of progress, not just in terms of past, but also in terms of future and what can actually happen as a result. So I'm excited to get into the details and the nuts and bolts of what exactly that looks like, because it's a great structure for our coaching to provide edges and definition and detail for, again, so many of those well-intended leaders who are motivated, want to have these types of conversations. They just don't have the skills and knowledge to understand how they involve themselves with their own talent into a framework of coaching that brings out the best of this particular element.
Mike, over managing over the last decade or so with Communication 4, I spent a lot of time talking. And I spent a lot of time talking to my people. As we shift the methodology a little bit from annual reviews to, these more persistent, more frequent communications, these check-ins, that's kind of been it's kind of been a no-brainer for me in a lot of ways. I've kind of thought this has been one of those areas I'm like, didn't everybody do that? Because I would spend a ton of time trying to just talk to those. In fact, maybe too much so in some cases, trying to have those constant check-in, those constant development. But we've definitely put some frameworks around this that is more than just talking to them. So let's spend a little time. Let's dig deep on this one. Why don't you dive in for us?
Yeah, there's an amazing experience around this item and a lot to learn. But again, I'm going to really speak directly to our re-engineering performance management report. So a lot of data and that empirical story that really comes out for what our research findings tell us. But I think if we back this out, we think about the manager, Jim, and to the frequency that you just referenced, when a manager's when they're regularly checking in with an employee, there's a shift in our perception of our entire experience. So I would almost contend, Jim, when you say maybe too much, I don't know if that's possible. A little bit kind of our recognition item. I'm not sure if I have yet to see an environment or a culture where they're suffering from too much communication, right? And what that means when it's done well. But the shift in perspective when those regular manager conversations happen, that individual on the receiving end is more likely to consider themselves properly even compensated for their work, more likely to plan on staying with their company, and more than twice as likely to recommend that company to others as a great place to work. So it completely transforms, quite frankly, the meaningfulness of our workplace when we do have those conversations. So we have a real terrific conversation that takes full stock of where we're at our best and what we can possibly do. The resonance of all of that is almost beyond our ability to restrain, right? We just can't help but influence other people through the energy that's really generated in how we feel in that conversation. So there's a real art and science to the delivery there. And it's interesting too, because you see so many organizations that pursue, the conventional nature of the annual review, right? And this really is an expansion of that perspective around the annual review. That annual review is being debunked now as something that just couldn't carry the weight of an entire year's worth of conversations and feedback. Not that there's anything wrong with it by itself, but it can't be the end all be all. That as human beings, we require infinitely more pace, progress through the feedback that's being provided and the potential that we have to offer than just one time a year for 60 minutes in where a well-intended team leader tries to cram pay, goals for the new year, some sort of gauge of what happened in the past, maybe something developmentally, and heaven forbid they try to squeeze anything personally into it, where maybe it's acknowledging what's happened outside the workplace and incorporating that into a perspective of progress in that person's journey. So this actually does the conversation, and we'll get into this a little bit more detail. I'll tease this, but one of the conversations that we would advise that team leaders and associates involve themselves with is really a progress review that would approximate the traditional annual review. It just can't happen once a year. We would really advise it happens a couple times a year, and that really line itself up directly with this one particular element. And we could talk about how we build that out, but I like the connection between this element and that conversation of the 5 that's discussed in detail in our reengineering performance management paper, and how we can actually intentionally accumulate the evidence, build a great conversation, and really strike a blow towards a 5 on this particular item.
Mike, there's a lot of pushback, and we got some feedback from those individuals now, not just the managers, but those getting the reviews, in down to that level. What's the need? We talk about the needs of followers, right? And I think this really plays to that. Is that individuals being managed really crave or desire certain things. And so there's a few things when we look at those. What are the basics on that, Mike? What can we look at that every manager should know to be able to hit these right?
Yeah, well, Jim, so I was kind of holding off on this because you took us down this trail of hope, right? And it's really funny, sometimes I think we get a little bit uncomfortable, quite frankly, when if we start tossing around the word hope as a manager practice, as an outcome. Sometimes people are like, gosh, isn't that something on the front of a Hallmark card? I feel like that's really fluffy. We're already talking about engagement, which challenges me and stretches me a little bit when we start talking about managing the behavior of human beings through their emotional content. But boy, you bring hope into the equation, and I really feel like we're starting to get out there. But if you break hope down in terms of what it represents as a positive psychology construct, it has some hard edges to it as powerful drivers of our decision making. And it really is according to our research, right, our strengths-based leadership book, really is a very powerful management practice. And I think if we understand it better by breaking it down, I think there's a lot of utility there. And let's just do that right now. So here's hope in a couple ways that I think it helps us get handles on it in a way that we can align it towards feeling progress, past tense, feeling progress, future tense. Let's use hope. Hope in a binary way. Hope is about having the willpower, but the way power. And great team leaders really help augment or accentuate that sense of hope, instill hope in each individual that they lead by doing 2 things. One is, and this is consistent with our performance development approach, they inspire people, right? They tap into what inspiration exists within that person and really capture that motivation, capture that emotion in a way that they've got that engine, right, that's revved up and ready to go. Now, that by itself doesn't get us there, right? So the engine, if you think about the metaphor of a car, it means we can go fast. It means we can go a long time, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're going in the right direction. So the willpower it needs to be established, but then the way power has to be impact from that as well. So if we've got this reserve and this reservoir of energy and we're ready to go out and do something with it, based on that great conversation we've had, what are the strategies? What are the tactics? What are the outcomes? What is the way power? Who are the people that come alongside us that help us arrive at those outcomes in all the ways that are right for us? If we take willpower and way power, if we break those down to a higher level of detail, and again, Shane Lopez did a fantastic job of teaching this to us, we can break it down into even smaller units of understanding that help us deliver it through this alignment towards progress in the past 6 months. So what we can do is we can understand hope through agency, pathways, and goals. So goals on the surface, right, is pretty explicit, right? It just tells us where do we want to be based on where you've come as a person on my team. Where is realistic for where you ought to go? What's the horizon we ought to claim? And what are the measurements and the marks that will represent that we've arrived when we do, and our journey and progress along the way? So goals is a big part of that. Pathways really gets into what are the strategies that we're going to employ. So Jim, if your go-to is talking to you and you're having a great conversation, a progress review conversation that's aligned with question 11, that conversation might ask you, so based on your strengths, Jim, what's been the most resistance-free path that we've discovered in the past where you found success, and how do we actually create that into a super highway that takes you on to more profound success with less effort and greater impact for the rest of our organization. And I would contend maybe most misunderstood, but the other area we think of goals and pathways is this other notion of agency, right? And agency is, who are the people around you that really matter? Who are the people that are those power of two combinations that work really well with you? Who are the other team members that you contribute to or contribute to you that really help make sense out of where you've been and where you're going? And so when we have our conversations around those very defined constructs of hope and that makeup, that DNA of hope, we really can manage. We really can move to it. And it's not a hallmark card, but it's rather maybe a hallmark management practice that we have a lot of potential to drive performance from.
Mike, we often think of progress or checking someone's progress as being a one-way management metric and measurement, right?
Yeah.
And really, when you talk about setting goals, it becomes an important that implies that it's a two-way street. In other words, the employee is helping in that process. What do we know? Like, what does that do for engagement when the goal setting is done in a two-way street between the manager and the employee? And what are we seeing? How does that affect the engagement when those kinds of things happen?
Yeah. So, the main thing is honestly that associate on in that part of the conversation on the receiving end of it. They need to know how their contribution is perceived. So there is a reality perception component to this conversation, and where is that work necessarily leading? And I think it's important for us we've done this before in previous discussions, but start to think about team leaders putting those combinations of other elements into what's represented by question 11. And we see a lot of question number 4, quite frankly, showing up in the alignment with question 11. So what's that combination of recognition and praise? How does it accumulate and arrive at a really powerful conversation around question number 11? And so when we do those well, and there is a lot of empirical evidence that makes sense out of those two together, companies that do that well, they actually, let me just back that out. Without the combinations of those other items, if we just focus on just the evaluation process itself, just the transactional delivery, you can become respectable. You can get from a below average to respectable in terms of what we see, poor levels to modest gains. But to really get to world class, to get to best in practice, we need to see those combinations. And this is where, if we think about that hierarchical nature, question 11 really represents the accumulation through the previous 10 that we would want represented in that discussion, that progress review discussion. So what are the relationships? What is the recognition and praise that's been received? What's been the gauge of progress? What are the measurements that would represent that you've come a certain distance in your own performance? And there's some evidence that that's being done well. We just don't have enough from a team leadership perspective. We need to do a lot more. Even when we look at executives and senior managers, actually more than 2/5 would strongly agree. Only 2/5 would strongly agree that somebody's talked to them about their own progress in the past 6 months. So we go back to that cascade effect. It's really important as coaches that we're fulfilling that type of conversation, even with those team leaders that we're working with, right? Who's talking to them about their own progress and taking stock and taking gauge of where they're at and where they could be. So it's a great, again, I'll use the word intersection, but it's a great intersection for our coaching to come in with a cadence and a rhythm around every 6 months that makes sense out of what our coaching opportunities ought to look like with leaders of teams and what it means for that leader to be right in order for their teams to be right around this particular item.
I actually think for coaches, there's a great opportunity in Q11 with who you're coaching, especially if you're coaching managers, that this is not a one and done conversation. I think we know from our work and some work that's coming out here in the future that the manager has really the greatest impact on the engagement in the organization. And so if you can have that effect, sometimes we approach this coaching like, okay, you're going to take strengths. We're going to do a feedback session. You're going to get a little bit of coaching and then that's it. And okay, we'll see in 6 months.
Right.
And I think we've actually, as coaches, we need to take that same methodology and apply it to more of, let's do a 5-minute phone call one day a week just to see how things are going. And 5 minutes is maybe a little too short, but like you get my point. Maybe we need to have these conversations, especially with the managers, a little more often, a little less intense, maybe, especially in duration, but maybe more. I don't know, Mike. Respond to that a little bit. What thoughts?
No, you're exactly right. I think so. So if we take this whole perspective and back it out and overlay it over the course of a year, you're exactly right, Jim. So again, if we take the annual review, which just couldn't carry the weight, right? Which was just staggering under the weight of an entire year's worth of developmental feedback and conversations. And instead, we start to distribute it evenly in smaller bits with more relevance that's threaded into just a normal conversation in the way we approach work. It shifted the entire perspective. It shifts our entire emotional and our involvement around what we feel like is happening in terms of our own growth, in terms of our own progress. And so the progress review as a conversation, and we'll talk more in detail at the end of our cast today, is really now positioned so much more effectively. It approximates the annual review, but Jim, when you have more frequent touch points, and we see definite correlations to the increase in engagement when there is greater frequency of those conversations with managers, the check-in, the quick connect, the developmental review, all of these things. I'm going to make these reference points intentionally as bait so that all of you go out and download that Reengineering Performance Management Report, because I think it's really important for us as coaches to be very well versed in what each of those conversations represents and looks like, because it is going to make a difference in your coaching. And there's a huge response from team leaders who see the detail and the structure of what those conversations look like and how they ought to be delivered. And if we can align our coaching with that outcome for that particular team leader, it will really accentuate the engagement levels of their team on the other side. Jim, I want to talk about, can we talk about where this goes wrong? Can we
hold that thought for 1 second. Dave's got a question related to what you just talked about. So he said, the question states someone, right, in quotes, talks to me about progress. Is there data or thoughts about conversations about progress with peers? We haven't mentioned that yet, but before we go into what's wrong, Mike, some of your thoughts on where's our science on this? And obviously we use the word someone because it's not always the direct manager, right, that has these conversations.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I love the way we pick up on what's representing these items, right? Because I do want to accentuate that there's only one that actually talks about the team leader specifically, right? My supervisor or someone at work cares about me as a person, and even then it's qualified by, or someone at work seems to care about me as a person. So the language obviously matters. So Dave, I think that's great that you caught that. Here's what we know is that in terms of the delivery and the approach, that it is beyond the check off the box. Even if we say we should have this type of conversation or a conversation that brings out the best of this item twice a year with a manager, that's still just a transactional delivery. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about how the fact that even the default accountability around having a progress review conversation twice a year only takes the impact of that from poor to modest. And when we think of that culture of a team level culture of mutual collaboration, mutual meaningfulness around this particular item, this is where as coaches and as team leaders, we really have the opportunity working through that agency portion of hope to think about and help the person we're working with start to assemble people around them that bring out the best of what that progress can look like. And so a lot of times it's very effective in those conversations to be very explicit and literally for us to be asked, who are those people? Let's name names. Let's make them a formal and integrated part of your developmental plan. So Jim, when you think about your individual development plan, think about the incorporation of names of people who are complementary partners to us, or somehow there's an alignment of our strengths. And what happens when your maximizer and my maximizer gets together, and we can see lots of different features about what those partnerships represent. And what it happens and at this level of engagement, we are in a mindset, right, of where a lot of our identity is captured by how do we affect and influence other people. So it's a perfect positioning if we can coach and structure the conversation to ask about who those people are that make us better, but then also conversely, who are those expected audience members that we would gauge our progress, gauge our impact by based on their response and the value we bring from that internal partnership. There's so much awareness, and we start to create that interrelationship between teams and internal customers that makes sense out of that someone at work portion of this question. And again, remember, we're at question 11 of 12 as we think about that ascent up that engagement journey. So,
Mike, I have a lot of responsibility for individuals that are dotted lines to me in the matrix. Right. And I, as a manager, I take this question, I think about this question a lot in the context of, even though I'm not their direct first line supervisor, whatever that means, that I have a responsibility in the organization to make sure everyone I'm working with, by the way, not just, I see this in other managers, other peers, right? And that it's my responsibility to make sure that if I'm in a direct line of sight for performance, that I give them feedback on a regular basis. I think that's just smart, right? And so I love the way we question this someone, because I as a manager, even though I'm not responsible for them in that sense, I am responsible for the overall engagement in the organization. And so I need to make sure I'm giving them feedback and progress. Our admins are in that role here at Gallup, where they don't report necessarily into the teams. We have a team that's separate from them, and in some ways that works out really, really well. But I do see it as my job with anybody that I'm working with, that I'm giving them constant progress feedback on how things are going, and almost treat it like it's a direct line, without all the other stuff that has to go with it.
Right.
And so I would encourage coaches, as you're coaching managers, not only do they own not only do they own the engagement of their direct line, but they in the engagement of their peers, as well as their direct line or their dotted line responsibilities as well. It's daunting, right, when you start thinking about it in all those terms, but you can't just, if you start focusing just on your direct line, just start getting these really thin lines of responsibility, and you begin to stop thinking, like, you start throwing things over the wall, or you start thinking that's another team's problem, or you start thinking, along the lines, that's not my responsibility. That's super dangerous from an organizational standpoint. And this question, I think, cuts that off at the pass. If I'm not only worried about giving progress to my team, but that my team is giving progress checks to other teams, like, that's super important. Back to this idea of hope, that teams have to rely on other teams for progress checks. How are we doing? This is one thing I think we do really well here at Gallup, is teams checking in with other teams and concerned about, hey, how are we affecting how are we giving you feedback on how you're doing as a team? And so that's another thing. Sometimes we think of this question means an individual, but are we getting organizational feedback from divisions, groups, whatever, right?
Absolutely. I think, Jimmy, don't you? I mean, and I love the data supports it, but boy, if we aren't making a direct connection between question 11 and question 4, we're missing an opportunity here. There's so much, and I would contend, if we do recognition right, that somewhere in that recognition, we are giving a specific indication of progress within that recognition.
Right on.
And if we are doing question 11 right, there's a lot of recognition that's involved in what evidence, if I use that word, what evidence is there that we made progress, So I think that the two play together so well. And I love the way our research confirms our intuition around that, because it is very true. And I love that power of two complementary partnership and dynamic between those two items if we do them well. And I think the other thing too, I think it makes it easier, to your point, Jim, about understanding, gosh, what's my mechanism for delivering this with enough frequency and authenticity and something that has a meaningfulness to it? Well, if we break question 11 down, it is literally kind of an extended delivery of question 4. It's just got a validation of question 4 over a continuum of time that then we do take stock of and take an assessment of a couple times a year to see how much of that quote unquote evidence has been accumulated along the way.
Yeah. And in that operative word in 4 is really meaningful. And so, like, if yes, you could do these, you could pass this recognition on in a passive aggressive way to try and manipulate other teams to do what you want, or other people, right? But that doesn't work. Like, we know the data doesn't support that. It has to be meaningful and appear to be meaningful. And so I really like that as a quality check in that question, that and that I think filters down to 11. And so if we're giving meaningful, like you're saying, if we're giving meaningful recognition and we're doing it on a frequent basis every 7 days, you can't not get this progress check on a regular basis, right? I mean, it would really be hard not to. So it's a good check of that, by the way. If you're low on this but high on that, if you're low on 11 and high on 4, I think it brings some interesting questions in there, right? A different set of questions. Mike, you alluded to this and I cut you off. Let's come back to it. Where does it go wrong?
Well, we always like to be weakness focused, Jim, right? That's the kind of the centerpiece of the show. So I thought, let's talk about where it's all broken and needs fixed. But maybe more seriously, though, I think these are great opportunities for us as coaches to get a good diagnostic in terms of the what ifs, right? So if you're working with a team leader and this is a compromised or brittle element for them, how do you reinforce it? How do you help them understand where they can come in and provide some structure to it that really produces the best of what it represents? And so here's where it misses. Reviews are constantly late, or some people actually never get reviews. Now, I think we probably more often than not will work with leaders who can set the date on their calendar to have the conversation. But nonetheless, what we really want to have there is that statement of how many times have we postponed this particular meeting because it was a client demand, or seemingly we were responding or reacting to something else in the course of our day. And that just doesn't feel great. So I would, as we set up accountabilities around the team leaders we're working with, boy, that's sacred ground. When they really plant a flag in that conversation, the rest of the world, the rest of the workplace should as best as we possibly can, should fall to a distant second place. So I really want to encourage our mutual reinforcement as we coach and work with managers that they really do need to claim that territory in real estate for that conversation. Some other experiences around it that this item that don't necessarily deliver well is that the process seems a little bit arbitrary or ineffective. And that's where I really encourage us, again, as coaches or as team leaders, to keep a steady, ongoing a journal, an accumulation as you lead your team member. I have input, so it's easy for me. So as people in my team hit certain milestones, or if there's a signature accomplishment that they've done, or maybe it's a third party recognition or so on, I just cut and paste and just keep an ongoing portfolio or profile of that person. So I feel like I've got a lot of content for that conversation that really validates it and gives it some weight. Certainly having some measurements along the way that are meaningful relative to maybe their goals at the beginning of the year, or if there's a certain scorecard that reflects the best of their performances, those are great ways to bring those things in. The other thing that I like to do too is I think this conversation represents a more holistic part of who we are as individuals. And so not only collecting evidence of the performance and those signature milestones along the way for that person inside the workplace, but I love to capture what they've done outside the workplace as well. And so if they're involved in a community group that's having success, a formal role they've taken in a philanthropy or charity, something personal, or if they've had a child that graduated from high school, or a child that got accepted into college, or any of those types of things. Not that we're actively coaching them on it, but I think it's just a great scorecard when we think about that transition, Jim, in the workplace and the demand that we all have now for the focus to move away from just an emphasis of an emphasis of job, and actually to pull the lens back to where it's life now. It really makes that conversation robust. And when we talk about hope and a horizon, it's just impossible to have that be the most powerful conversation it can be without integrating who we are inside and outside the workplace. And I think there's a statement there of leadership that we see the whole person when we have that conversation right and do it well. On a much, I'll come off of that, the kind of that mountaintop of description there. But the other things that are missing in this conversation really is that strong performance isn't getting rewarded. So there might be the feedback around it, the recognition around it, but in essence, it never really translates to my top tier performance separating or distinguishing what I get in terms of pay even, or promotions relative to others who are not. So it really calls into account some transparency around everything about our performance development approach and structure at the organization and team level. So while we can have a great conversation with a lot of emotion and perception to it, and instill a lot of hope out of it, fundamentally that should be backed up and held into alignment, into account by what am I actually receiving from this particular job and the opportunity I have. And then Jim, let's go back to, and then the last thing that's missing that really supports this notion of progress really well, and you hit it earlier, there's just not enough day-to-day feedback on performance. And so we're missing that recipe, or that ingredient to the recipe.
Keeps the manager focused on the task at hand as well. Sometimes it's easy to get separated from what's going on the ground because of meetings or other responsibilities or other things to do. And that kind of that day-to-day pressure, I think, is important to have in there, and a great reminder. Mike, the millennials often get credited for a lot of these changes that are going on. I like to debunk that. I think these are natural progressions in the workplace that happen to land during this generation. I think most employees, whether they are millennials or older Xers or, boomers before that, most of the boomers are retiring at this point. But Mike, we do have some numbers on these, right? There's reasons we're making this shift. And so as we think about some of these numbers, what are we seeing? And out of the state of, or out of the millennial report, what are we seeing?
Yeah, it was really interesting. This was kind of a signature takeaway from our study and understanding of that particular generation. So here's something that's really important for our coaching as we think about coaching somebody who might be representative of that millennial mindset and generation, or if we're coaching somebody who has, a team of individuals who are mainly comprised of millennials. And I think we all know, if we're paying attention, that by 2020, 70% of the workplace is estimated to be represented by the millennial generation. So if you aren't ready for it by now, we're going to sound the alarm, because it's coming soon, very, very quickly. A lot of organizations, Jim, that we're working with right now are already at 70%. So when we think about leading that group, there was a very interesting dichotomy in terms of their perspective around feedback that I think is important for us to consider with question number 11. So here's the results of our millennial report around this particular element. So somewhat consistent with all of the workplace, millennials do not receive enough routine and meaningful feedback. In fact, only 19% can say that they receive routine feedback. And then only 17% can actually say they receive meaningful feedback. Now, here's where it gets interesting, Jim. And I think this is where we have a leadership opportunity and a coaching opportunity to step in and bridge this perspective of feedback and the frequency around it. Millennials are, for some reason, and I don't have the study or the understanding about this, but it provokes discovery. Millennials, while they want more feedback, they're less likely to actually ask for it. Only 15% of millennials would strongly agree that they routinely ask for feedback. And only 33% strongly agree that they've actually told their manager what they need most to get their work done and why. So 15% strongly agree they routinely ask for feedback, and only 33% strongly agree that they've actually told their manager what they need most to get their work done and why. So there's an apprehension, there's just a gap there. But what it is a call to action for us as leaders and as coaches is that we have to have defaults around these types of conversations. We can't assume that no news is good news. And so the intentionality and the active involvement, Jim, going back even to your notion of frequency, we have to take the conversation to them. And we see not only that gap filled, but really profound outcomes that are driven when we step in, when we drive that conversation forward on behalf of the people on our teams who want that and need that.
Yeah, it does lead. I mean, it's interesting feedback, and there are the majority in the workforce today. And I think we need to pay attention to those numbers. I do think they're reflective. If we pulled the numbers of even the older workers, and I think they would say similar things.
Right.
And I do sometimes want to break this millennial myth down a little bit, that they're a different generation. They tend to be they're a little more outspoken, which has kind of led to some of these changes that we're seeing in the workplace.
Yeah.
And I think that by itself is doing great things. And so interesting, if you haven't dug into our millennial report, you might want to spend a little bit of time kind of working in that. There's some interesting insights, especially around this question. And I think both good and bad, they take the rap unnecessarily. They also get too much credit for some of the changes.
Right.
And so it's spoken like a true bitter Gen Xer. I'm just saying. Yeah. I'm just saying.
Mike, Jim, one thing I really want to accentuate the point you're making, though, because we do need to debunk some of the myths. So that's compelling research, and those are definitely empirical touch points that we should pay attention to. However, if we look at the mindset around feedback and performance development even more broadly, if we really start to look at the fact that it's not great for any of us, regardless of generation, a couple things that I did want to just expand from a data standpoint to reinforce what you were saying. 21% of employees strongly agree that their performance is managed in a way that motivates them to do outstanding work. So that's everybody, and it's still only at 21%. Only 18% of employees strongly agree that employees who perform better grow at a faster rate at their organization. So there's things, even in an overarching fashion that are missing for all generations. So I think the safest thing to say, while I think we have keen insight to what millennials are looking for in that dynamic, we have a long ways to go, I think, before we even start to worry about some of those nuances, right? We just need a lot more feedback and a lot better feedback in terms of what's represented in that regard. I mean, even I'm looking at a couple others here, Jim. 23% strongly agree that their manager provides them with meaningful feedback. 26% strongly agree that the feedback they actually do receive even helps them do better work. So we just have a wide open field of opportunity to move that experience around that element forward for everybody, not just millennials in that unique feature.
We provide some tools or some conversations or some ideas when we think about, as managers, what should we be asking ourselves of, so, what are we doing? And I think we have a list kind of that we've put together that we want to share on this. And I think this is very appropriate for this conversation, as well as a coach, really, asking the managers that you're coaching, are you doing these things? And not just are you, but how are you doing these things?
Yeah.
Get empirical evidence. Hear those things. How are you actually getting it done? Because it's a manager. It's, one of them is, are you strengths based? And that's oh yeah, totally. How? Show me how you're actually doing that. But Mike, let's talk through those characteristics of performance feedback.
Yeah, if we break that down to real brass tacks. So Jim, I'm going to align this conversation with question 11, again, very directly with one of the performance conversations that we mentioned in our reengineering performance management report. And so the conversation that we've studied and identified that's so important, I think, is and representative of question 11 is, again, just what we would call the performance review. There's some ingredients to what a well-constructed and delivered performance review looks like. One feature, it has to be achievement oriented, right? That it has to show tangible, measurable, and qualitative progress. So again, I use the term evidence. How much evidence do we actually have that would represent that we've come so far and that things have happened along the way? Would we be found guilty, right, of making progress if we play out that metaphor? Is it fair and accurate? Can we put this evidence in front of that person on our team who's receiving that feedback, and can they feel that there's a objectivity to it, as well as a fairness in the subjectivity of it, right? The individualized delivery as well as the consistent delivery of it, so that the measurements are consistent and uniform really for all of us, but some of the nuances and unique qualitative contributions that are central to who we are as an individual are acknowledged and taken into account. So fair and accurate. And then ultimately developmental, right? That not only is my performance and productivity increasing, but there's self-awareness, there's discovery about my abilities, there are relationships and impact that we're taking into account, and that we have a real tight definition on, that we have formally integrated into what this conversation looks like and what it represents as I think about how I grow futuristically. It would be the fifth of the five that we would outline in our five conversations that really develop performance and drive performance. And again, I just encourage, I think you guys will have a great time getting inside that report if you haven't had a chance to really explore it thoroughly. But if we pull the progress review out, what it really represents is this notion of accountability, that somewhere over the course of 6 months, we haven't completely lost our way around our goals, and that there's an accountability to us coming back and taking stock of what did we say we were going to do, and we'll gauge our progress towards actually following through on that. And when you think about even accountability as a leading indicator of engagement, we have to have these conversations. Otherwise, we feel like we just get lost in the spin cycle, and now we're just fighting to make it through a day that we're responding to, right? That we're not driving anything from. So progress reviews at their core in their original delivery really are about having engaging developmental conversations that are grounded in a well-rounded view of the performance expectations that matter most to that person, the team leader and to the team that they actually are expected to implement and to impact. Jim, if we actually break it down even more and get into a scope and a detail and outline of what the progress review represents, the what behind the conversation is to help employees think about their goals, their purpose, performance metrics, their strengths, and development. The frequency around it, it's a very effective conversation. We would encourage you to have it about twice a year, and it can be anywhere from 1 to 3 hours. So when I talk about really establishing space, and we all know this as coaches, right? That we want that the best coaching happens when we're present and available and involved. That's the exact same mindset that we would want to encourage team leaders to enter into as they have this conversation, right? This needs presence, this needs a mindfulness, and it needs a level of involvement where they've really pushed back on the demands today and just settled into, we are going to focus on you in this progress review. And in a why is it just that we know progress reviews really help celebrate successes. They help prepare us for future achievements and, quite frankly, to take advantage of intentionally and plan for future development and growth opportunities. So the blocking and tackling of what that actual conversation looks like and how it can really drive question 11 if it's done well, I think it's something that we can get our hands on and do on purpose.
Mike, as we kind of bring this one in for a landing, final thoughts, what do you want to leave the coaches with?
Yeah, I think the main thing, if I was just to come back and really encourage us, if we look at some of the just deliverable best practices that managers really involve themselves with, first off, and this is where I think you as coaches can really help them, is there's so much about these conversations that are driven by manager habit, team leader habit, and have they assembled habits around feedback that are really effective, that really have them accountable to a default mentality where, Jim, what is it about you and how have you taken advantage of your strengths and a structure that causes you to give effective feedback with the right frequency and content to your team and your internal partners in the way that they all need it. So I think it's really useful for all of us as coaches to think about how is it that we're coaching managers in the development of their effective feedback habits? How do they use their top 5 strengths to make sure that they're always delivering great feedback and that there's a commitment to those conversations and the quality of what they're supposed to represent. Another thing that I'd like to have us think about is just that notion. Again, whatever habit we have, but there's a need to have an accumulation of evidence along the way over the course of these 6 months or whenever we have our progress review conversations, that we're accumulating that evidence and then that we bring it back out and provide feedback around it in a way that's got recognition wrapped with it, that's got potential growth and relationships and impact represented in it. And quite frankly, even representative of the 10 previous elements of engagement represented it. Where have been the touch points that navigated through and were experienced through each of those 10 items that preceded number 11 that we can speak to that provide evidence of progress and growth. And so I think if we were to give even more handles on that, think about certifications that maybe somebody has attained. ICF is a big one, Jim, for my team right now, and they are doing an amazing job of all of them getting certified through that particular organization. So that's one that we're really having big recognitions around as a milestone for this year for all of them to achieve. Team members of the month, other goals that they set at the beginning of the year that were personally and professionally unique to them. We take stock of those and make sure that we gauge them. And as well, I love the integration. I mentioned this earlier, but I think it's really important in this conversation discussion that we're bringing their entire life into this conversation. And by entire life, I'd like to bring in qualitative examples of the impact they're having outside the workplace and making sure that we're really acknowledging growth and progress in this conversation and as it impacts that particular item. So just 3 particular points that I hope are useful for all of us in our coaching, particularly as we think about leveraging the impact that a leader has on and through their team.
Mike, we've got a few reminders, so some resources that we have available with some training and some additional things folks can purchase if they want more information. Walk us through those. Yeah,
absolutely. So again, starting off with our Engagement Champion course, could not encourage you all more to consider that, to explore that. It's a 2-day course, and if you're really looking for elite subject expertise and mastery of the research and the science of engagement, how to coach team leaders on through engagement, how do you diagnose, tell stories out of data, help lead and create a structure and an understanding of engagement-related performance that really, I guess if you were to be honest, Jim, we could almost say it represents question 11 almost as a program, right? How do we take a whole team and an organization through this mindset of receiving feedback around performance and then driving it forward into an intentional future? This course is got a lot of value packed into it for the ability of a coach to do that, even expanding into that lens of consultant as a result. Jim, what's really exciting, I think, relative to the conversation we had today, when we think about the conversations that drive performance and our re-engineering performance management report, we have another course, flagship leadership course, Leading High-Performing Teams. Leader understanding through strengths is the first part of the outline in that course, taking on through to understanding their team strengths. How do they leverage that understanding of strengths to drive engagement for their team and then ultimately to drive performance on their team? And really aligned with the conversation we had today, the course, it's 2 days. The second half of the second day is a wrap around each of these 5 performance development conversations. And so it really gets deep into the architecture, the structure, the content, the frequency, all of the details that are necessary to really involve those conversations and apply them for really powerful impact and performance. And then we'll conclude this, but with always a reference to, if those schedules don't line up, if you just don't have the availability to join either one of those courses, absolutely do not wait. Get the engagement starter pack. It's got the first break all the rules book. It's got the creating an engagement workplace for manager packet in it, which is great for you to understand and how you can apply it in your coaching and managers, but also as an extension that you can offer to other managers that you're working with. And so your coaching can bring out the best through those resources. And then there's 2 sets of discussion cards in there that are really fantastic in helping that team leader that you're working with, that you're coaching, really think about their efforts and how they maximize their coaching by great questions, great understanding where there might be pushback and barriers, and how do they understand all those things futuristically in a way that they can take their team forward on through really powerful coaching.
All right. Good enough. Mike, thanks for taking some time. We have one more question left in this Q12 next week. Want to give a little preview?
Yeah. So number 12, past 12 months, opportunities to learn and grow. So just think about this preceding question right now. We want to think about how does progress in the past 6 months then lead us to think about what we've learned and how we've grown, and what those opportunities have represented futuristically for the next 12 and from the previous 12. And so the lens gets pulled back as just about as far as we can get it, Jim. We're looking at a 12-month experience around that. So when we talk about, I love the foundational conversation we had today about hope and future and the intentionality of what that construct can look like, because I think it really plays itself out in a powerful way when we think about item number 12 and how we coach and lead to and through it.
Super. It's and much like 4 and 11, as we think about 12 and the idea of someone, this development question that we asked earlier, they go together nicely. So some good opportunities to dig into that next week, I think, or is it 2 weeks? Do we have a week off in there? Can't remember. Doesn't really matter. Yeah. You're listening to this in time shifted, and you don't really care. We'll remind everyone.
We can't wait either way. So whenever, yeah.
Well, just hit play or skip and move on to 12. It'll be there for you. We'll remind everyone to take full advantages of all the resources we have available at the Gallup Strength Center. Just GallupStrengthCenter.com. Send us your questions or comments. We'd love to get some feedback from you on this. You can send those to us via email, coaching@gallup.com. You can also catch the recorded audio and video of this program as well as all the past ones. They're available all on our coaches blog. Go to coaching.gallup.com if you're interested in becoming a Gallup certified strengths coach. Or like Mike mentioned, there's some courses available for you now. We've got a ton coming up. By the time you're listening to this, we'll have even more. Head out to our courses page, courses.gallup.com, and you can see everything that's available, where it's available, when it's available, and how we offer it available for you. If you want to keep track of all the webcasts that we're doing a bunch, and you want to stay up to date, you can follow us out on Eventbrite. So go to gallup.eventbrite.com, create an account, and click the follow. We'll send you an email every time we update, and we do that from time to time. You'll get a big blast all at once because we update about once a month or so, adding new things that are coming in. But it's a great way. A lot of people say, how do I keep track of all this stuff? Well, that's how you keep track of it. So join us there. Don't forget to join us on our Facebook group, facebook.com/group/called2coach. We'll get you there. Lots of information on there, and we kind of dialogue about what we talked about here there. So join us in the Facebook group as well. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be back with Q12 whenever. And with that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.